The fiercest wolf in the kingdom should have returned with a trophy from the hunt, but instead, he carried home the smallest life anyone had ever seen. Dawn spread across Blackwood Palace in ribbons of pale gold as mist drifted above the royal forest, wrapping ancient oaks and silver pines in a quiet veil that softened even the hardest edges of the kingdom. Every morning followed the same rhythm. Guards changed shifts with disciplined precision. Stable hands prepared the king's horses. Servants hurried across polished stone courtyards before the palace fully awakened. Above them all stood the towering castle, its dark walls overlooking forests that stretched for miles, where only the strongest creatures survived. At the center of this powerful kingdom ruled Alpha King Ethan Blackwood, a leader whose calm authority commanded respect without raising his voice. Stories about him traveled across distant lands. Some claimed he could calm an entire council with a single glance. Others believed no creature in the forest dared challenge the enormous gray wolf that never left his side. They called that wolf Fenrir. Larger than any ordinary timber wolf, Fenrir moved with quiet confidence, his silver-gray coat catching the morning light like polished steel. Yet those who truly knew him understood that beneath his intimidating appearance lived remarkable patience and unwavering loyalty. Every sunrise, before court meetings and royal duties began, Ethan allowed Fenrir to roam freely through the royal forest surrounding the palace. It was more than routine. The walks reminded both king and wolf that true strength belonged first to nature. On this particular morning, however, something felt different. The previous night's storm had scattered broken branches across winding woodland paths. Tiny streams overflowed onto moss-covered trails, while birds cautiously returned to their nests after hours of thunder and heavy rain. Fenrir moved silently between towering trees, his sharp eyes studying every movement. Suddenly, he stopped. A faint sound barely louder than a whisper drifted through the damp air. It wasn't the rustle of leaves or the chatter of returning songbirds. It was a soft, exhausted peep. Fenrir lowered his head and slowly stepped toward a cluster of reeds beside a narrow pond formed by the storm. Hidden beneath wet leaves rested a tiny duckling, its pale feathers soaked from the rain, one small wing drooping awkwardly as it struggled to stand. The little bird looked up with wide, frightened eyes, too tired to flee and too weak to understand that one of the kingdom's greatest predators now stood only inches away. For a long moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Even the breeze became still. Fenrir leaned closer, his enormous nose gently brushing aside the leaves surrounding the trembling duckling. Instead of growling, instead of walking away, the great wolf carefully lowered himself onto the damp ground. The duckling blinked once, then took a tiny, uncertain step forward before collapsing against the warmth of the wolf's thick fur. When the palace guards finally spotted Fenrir emerging from the forest an hour later, every one of them froze in disbelief. The mighty royal wolf wasn't carrying a prize from the hunt. Resting carefully between his gentle jaws was the smallest injured duck anyone in Blackwood Palace had ever seen. None of them realized that before the sun would set, this tiny visitor would begin changing not only Fenrir's life, but the heart of an entire kingdom. The news spread through Blackwood Palace faster than the ringing of the morning bell. By the time Fenrir reached the grand courtyard, servants had already stopped sweeping marble paths, stable hands leaned over wooden fences, and even the royal gardeners paused with dirt still clinging to their gloves. Every pair of eyes followed the giant wolf with silent disbelief. Carefully, as though carrying something made of glass, Fenrir crossed the courtyard and climbed the broad stone steps leading toward the palace entrance. Resting gently between his jaws, the tiny duckling barely moved except for an occasional weak blink. Captain Daniel Brooks, commander of the Royal Guard, instinctively stepped forward before stopping himself. He had served Alpha King Ethan Blackwood for nearly 15 years and had witnessed Fenrir facing raging rivers, frightened horses, and panicked crowds with perfect composure. Never once had he seen the royal wolf behave like this. "Your Majesty should know," Daniel whispered, unable to hide the astonishment in his voice. Moments later, Ethan emerged from the palace wearing a simple charcoal coat instead of his formal royal robes. He had expected an urgent report about storm damage along the northern roads, not a gathering of speechless servants staring at his companion. His silver eyes settled first on Fenrir, then lowered toward the tiny bundle resting safely inside the wolf's careful grip. The courtyard became completely silent. Ethan slowly approached, his polished boots echoing across the stone. Fenrir did not move. He simply looked up at his lifelong companion with calm certainty before lowering his head a little farther. The duckling opened one sleepy eye and released a tiny peep that almost disappeared beneath the whisper of the morning breeze. Ethan knelt without saying a word. Rainwater still clung to the little bird's pale yellow feathers, and one small wing rested awkwardly against its side. It looked exhausted rather than frightened, as though every ounce of strength had been spent simply surviving the storm. The king reached out with slow, careful hands. Instead of pulling away, the duckling relaxed the moment his fingertips touched its damp feathers. Fenrir watched every movement, his amber eyes never leaving the tiny bird. Daniel quietly cleared his throat. "Shall I have someone return it to the forest, Your Majesty?" Several servants exchanged hopeful glances. A duck inside the royal palace sounded ridiculous. There were rules for nearly everything in Blackwood Palace, from where flowers could bloom to which birds nested inside the gardens. Ducks had never been part of those traditions. Ethan remained silent for another long moment. Then he looked toward Fenrir. The great wolf had always accepted every royal command without hesitation. Today, however, he remained perfectly still, waiting with patient determination that almost resembled a request. Ethan could not remember the last time Fenrir had asked for anything. A faint smile touched the corner of the king's mouth. "Prepare a quiet place near the southern garden," he said calmly. "Bring clean towels, warm water, and ask Dr. Amelia Carter to examine the little one." A wave of surprise swept across the gathered crowd. No one argued, although several nobles watching from the palace balcony exchanged puzzled expressions. Ethan gently lifted the duckling into his arms. It weighed almost nothing, yet somehow the tiny creature seemed to change the atmosphere around everyone standing there. Fenrir walked beside the king as they crossed the sunlit courtyard together, while behind them whispers followed every step. None of them understood why the Alpha King had just made room inside his palace for a fragile duckling. But before the day was over, that impossible decision would become the beginning of a story the kingdom would remember for generations. The southern garden quickly became the most talked-about place in Blackwood Palace, although not for any reason the royal council would have appreciated. Dr. Amelia Carter gently wrapped the duckling's injured wing with a soft linen bandage, while Fenrir remained stretched across the garden stones only a few feet away, his watchful eyes following every careful movement. The little bird had already found enough strength to nibble at small pieces of grain and sip fresh water from a shallow ceramic bowl, but it refused to settle anywhere unless the great wolf stayed close. Whenever Fenrir wandered even a few steps away, tiny anxious peeps echoed through the garden until he returned. The sight puzzled everyone who witnessed it. By afternoon, whispers had traveled through every hallway, kitchen, library, and guard tower in the palace. Some servants smiled whenever they passed the garden, charmed by the unlikely friendship unfolding beneath blooming cherry trees. Others laughed behind covered mouths, convinced the entire situation would disappear within a day or two. The nobles, however, viewed the matter quite differently. During the afternoon council gathering, Lord Nathaniel Hawthorne adjusted the cuffs of his embroidered coat before speaking with carefully measured concern. "Your Majesty," he began, "our palace has always represented dignity and order. It seems rather unusual for a common duck to become a royal guest." Several council members quietly nodded in agreement. Lady Victoria Sinclair offered a polite smile that barely concealed her amusement. "Soon visitors may expect to see geese in the throne room or squirrels attending royal banquets." Soft laughter circled the long oak table. Ethan Blackwood listened without interruption. His expression remained calm as sunlight poured through the towering windows behind him. Finally, he folded his hands together. "It is recovering from the storm," he answered simply. Nothing more. The discussion ended there because no one dared argue further. Yet outside the council chamber, the jokes only multiplied. Stable workers jokingly saluted whenever the duckling waddled past. Kitchen assistants whispered that Fenrir had somehow forgotten he was a wolf. Even young pages delivering letters paused to peek through the garden gate before hurrying away with wide grins. None of the teasing seemed to matter to the duckling. Each passing hour revealed a personality far larger than its tiny size suggested. Instead of hiding beneath bushes, it followed Fenrir with determined little steps wherever he wandered through the southern garden. If the wolf stopped beneath an old maple tree, the duckling settled beside one enormous paw. If Fenrir stretched beneath the afternoon sun, the duckling curled comfortably against his thick silver fur as though it had always belonged there. Even more surprising, Fenrir appeared completely content with his constant shadow. One warm evening, Ethan quietly observed them from a nearby stone balcony overlooking the gardens. He watched as butterflies drifted through flowering bushes while the duckling proudly attempted to imitate the wolf's graceful stride. Every few steps it stumbled, shook its tiny feathers, then continued with even greater determination. For the first time in many months, the king found himself smiling without realizing it. Dr. Amelia noticed the expression and quietly joined him. "Sometimes," she said gently, "the smallest hearts remind the strongest ones how to slow down." Ethan glanced toward Fenrir, who lowered his head so the duckling could climb over one massive foreleg before nestling comfortably against his side. Around them, the palace still echoed with laughter and disbelief, but neither the wolf nor the little bird seemed interested in proving anyone wrong. They simply enjoyed each peaceful moment together, unaware that before long, every voice mocking their friendship would fall completely silent. 3 peaceful days passed, and with every sunrise the tiny duckling seemed to discover a little more confidence. The soft bandage around its wing remained, but its steps grew steadier, its bright eyes sparkled with endless curiosity, and its cheerful peeps echoed through the southern garden from dawn until sunset. The palace servants soon realized that no gate, flowerbed, or stone pathway could keep the determined little visitor from exploring every corner within reach. Wherever Fenrir walked, the duckling followed without hesitation, its tiny orange feet tapping quickly across polished marble floors whenever the great wolf was allowed inside the palace. At first, the guards tried to guide the duckling back toward the garden whenever it wandered too close to the royal corridors. The effort never lasted long. Somehow, the little bird always found Fenrir again. It squeezed beneath benches, waddled around towering columns, and confidently crossed wide hallways crowded with servants carrying silver trays and folded linens. More than once, startled maids nearly dropped baskets of fresh flowers after discovering the tiny traveler waiting patiently outside the royal library. Before long, everyone stopped trying to separate them. Dr. Amelia Carter declared the duckling healthy enough to remove the bandage, and the first careful stretch of its healed wing drew quiet applause from the gardeners working nearby. The little bird flapped both wings proudly, lifted itself only a few inches above the grass, and landed with surprising dignity despite the uneven attempt. Fenrir responded by gently nudging it forward with his nose, almost as though encouraging another try. Ethan happened to witness the moment from a nearby terrace while reviewing reports with Captain Daniel Brooks. Instead of returning immediately to palace business, the king quietly watched as the duckling repeated the effort again and again, each attempt carrying it slightly farther across the lawn. It never became frustrated. Every small success seemed enough reason to celebrate. "It refuses to give up," Daniel observed with a smile. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps that is why Fenrir chose it. The words lingered in Daniel's thoughts long after the king walked away. By the end of the week, another unusual change had begun attracting attention. Birds from the surrounding forests started gathering around the southern pond. First came a pair of mallards. Then several graceful white swans glided across the water. Bright blue herons appeared near the reeds, while colorful songbirds filled nearby branches with cheerful melodies. No one could explain why so many wild creatures suddenly preferred the palace gardens over the countless lakes scattered across the kingdom. Even stranger, they all seemed completely comfortable around the duckling. Instead of hiding, they calmly shared the shoreline as though accepting the tiny newcomer without question. The duckling greeted every arrival with enthusiastic little peeps before confidently waddling along the edge of the pond, as if introducing each visitor to its new home. Fenrir remained close, resting beneath an old willow tree while watching the growing gathering with quiet satisfaction. Palace servants gradually stopped laughing. The peaceful scene unfolding before them felt almost magical, though no magic could be seen. Children from nearby staff families were occasionally invited into the gardens, and they immediately fell in love with the fearless little duck that marched proudly beside the kingdom's most magnificent wolf. Their laughter replaced the earlier whispers of mockery. Even the palace cooks began saving fresh lettuce leaves and small handfuls of grain each morning without anyone asking them to. Ethan noticed the change during his evening walks. The southern garden no longer felt like a forgotten corner of the palace. It had become the warmest place within the castle walls, where worried faces softened, hurried footsteps slowed, and conversations naturally turned into smiles. Yet as peaceful as those days appeared, none of them realized that the quiet little pond was about to reveal a remarkable surprise that would leave the entire kingdom questioning whether leadership had ever depended on size at all. By the beginning of the second week, the southern pond no longer resembled the quiet garden it had once been. Every morning began with gentle ripples spreading across the clear water as ducks, swans, herons, turtles, and countless songbirds gathered before the sun climbed above the palace towers. The gardeners joked that the pond now kept its own schedule, more reliable than the royal clock. Yet one detail puzzled everyone who paused long enough to watch. The tiny duckling always stepped onto the shoreline first. It never rushed or flapped wildly. Instead, it waddled forward with surprising confidence, letting out 3 cheerful peeps before entering the water. Almost immediately, every bird seemed to notice. The swans shifted gracefully to one side, making space without hesitation. The ducks formed loose lines behind the little newcomer. Even the elegant herons quietly stepped away from their favorite fishing spots, as though following an invisible rule no human could understand. Fenrir observed everything from beneath the old willow tree, his tail sweeping lazily across the grass whenever the duckling glanced back toward him. The little bird always seemed reassured after finding the great wolf nearby, then proudly continued its morning rounds around the pond. Ethan Blackwood witnessed the strange ritual for the first time while taking an early walk before the day's meetings. He expected random movement among the birds, but what unfolded before him looked almost organized. The duckling drifted across the pond, and every other bird calmly adjusted its course until they all floated together in a loose circle around the smallest member of the gathering. "That cannot be coincidence," Captain Daniel Brooks quietly murmured beside the king. Ethan remained thoughtful. Leadership does not always announce itself with noise. Word of the unusual behavior spread quickly beyond the palace walls. Visitors arriving for trade discussions requested permission to stroll through the southern gardens after hearing rumors about the remarkable pond. At first, they came out of simple curiosity. They always left smiling. Children laughed as the duckling confidently marched along the stone pathways with a procession of birds following behind like cheerful little citizens. Elderly guests sat longer than planned beneath flowering trees simply to enjoy the peaceful scene. Traveling artists began sketching the unlikely parade, while musicians quietly composed playful melodies inspired by the tiny leader and its enormous guardian. Inside the palace, even the nobles who had mocked the duckling found themselves inventing excuses to pass through the southern garden. Lady Victoria Sinclair paused one afternoon behind a marble column, pretending to admire the roses while secretly watching the duckling guide an entire family of swans toward the center of the pond. Lord Nathaniel Hawthorne stood nearby with folded arms, determined not to appear impressed. Yet when the duckling stopped beside the water's edge and tilted its head toward him with bright, curious eyes, he unexpectedly smiled before quickly looking away, hoping no one had noticed. Dr. Amelia Carter quietly laughed to herself. Kindness has a remarkable way of winning arguments without speaking a single word, she whispered to one of the gardeners. Day after day, the southern pond became the happiest corner of Blackwood Palace. Servants lingered there during short breaks. Guards relaxed for a few peaceful moments before changing shifts. Even Ethan found himself ending difficult afternoons beside the water, watching Fenrir rest comfortably while the duckling confidently explored its growing little kingdom. It seemed impossible that anything could disturb such gentle harmony. Yet beyond the peaceful gardens and towering palace walls, unnoticed by everyone except the smallest resident of the pond, something unfamiliar had quietly entered the surrounding forest, and before another sunrise arrived, The cheerful little duck would become the very first to sense that change. The following morning arrived wrapped in cool silver mist that drifted quietly across the southern pond. Dew clung to every blade of grass, and the palace had not yet awakened to its usual rhythm of footsteps and conversation. Fenrir rested beneath the familiar willow tree while the duckling completed its daily walk along the water's edge. Everything appeared peaceful, yet something felt different. The cheerful birds that normally greeted the sunrise with joyful songs remained strangely silent. The swans floated closer together. Sparrows stayed hidden among thick branches instead of filling the air with music. Even the breeze seemed to move more carefully through the garden. The duckling stopped walking. Its tiny head slowly turned toward the northern forest beyond the palace walls. A faint sound had reached its sensitive ears, so distant that no human nearby could have noticed. It was not frightening. It was simply unfamiliar. The little bird released one short peep before looking directly at Fenrir. The great wolf immediately lifted his head. Years of protecting the kingdom had taught him to recognize when nature itself behaved differently. Without hesitation, he stood and quietly walked toward the duckling. Together they faced the distant tree line, watching in complete silence. A pair of gardeners entering the grounds paused when they noticed the unusual scene. "That is odd," one whispered. "The birds always sing by now." His companion nodded uneasily. "Perhaps another storm is coming." By breakfast, the palace returned to its normal routine. Servants polished silver trays, royal advisors carried stacks of documents through wide corridors, and cooks filled the kitchens with the comforting scent of fresh bread. Yet the duckling refused to leave the pond. Instead of happily greeting every visitor, it remained near the shoreline, occasionally glancing toward the northern woods. Fenrir stayed beside it all morning. Ethan Blackwood noticed the unusual behavior during his walk to the council chamber. "They seem restless today," he quietly observed. Captain Daniel Brooks followed the king's gaze toward the pond. "Perhaps they sense weather changing again." Ethan considered the answer but remained unconvinced. Fenrir had never shown unnecessary concern. If the great wolf appeared watchful, there was usually a reason. Later that afternoon, Dr. Amelia Carter visited the garden carrying a small basket of grain. The duckling accepted only a few bites before wandering back to the edge of the water, scanning the distant forest once more. Amelia gently smiled. "You usually have a much bigger appetite than this." The little bird answered with a soft peep before looking toward Fenrir again. Somehow, the wolf seemed to understand. He quietly circled the pond, carefully inspecting the nearby pathways and gardens with calm determination. Nothing appeared out of place. No broken fences. No damaged gates. No signs of danger. Even so, the strange silence continued. As evening settled across Blackwood Palace, golden light reflected beautifully across the still water. Most of the birds gradually returned to their nests, yet they remained unusually close together, as though seeking quiet comfort in one another's company. Ethan stood alone on the stone bridge overlooking the pond, watching the duckling nestle beside Fenrir beneath the willow tree. The king could not explain why the peaceful scene filled him with cautious anticipation rather than ease. It felt as though the entire garden was waiting for something unseen to reveal itself. Then, just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the forest, the duckling suddenly stood upright, fixed its bright eyes toward the darkening trees once more, and released the loudest, clearest call anyone in Blackwood Palace had ever heard from such a tiny creature. The sharp call echoed across the quiet palace grounds, and for a single remarkable moment, everything stopped. Guards paused in the middle of changing posts. Stable horses lifted their heads. Even the leaves hanging above the southern pond seemed to rest without movement. Ethan Blackwood turned immediately toward the sound. He had heard the duckling make cheerful peeps every day since its rescue, but this call carried an urgency unlike anything before. Fenrir reacted even faster. The great wolf rose in one smooth motion and silently positioned himself between the duckling and the open lawn leading toward the northern side of the palace gardens. His ears stood forward, every sense focused beyond the tree line. Captain Daniel Brooks instinctively signaled several nearby guards to remain alert, although none of them understood what had caused the sudden change. Minutes passed without incident. The sky remained clear. The evening breeze returned. Yet the duckling continued staring toward the distant forest, refusing to look away. Then a gentle rustling drifted from the tall grass beyond the outer garden fence. It was not loud. It sounded almost ordinary, but Fenrir immediately began walking toward the sound with calm determination. The duckling hurried after him, its tiny feet moving as quickly as they could across the stone pathway. Daniel and two guards followed at a respectful distance, while Ethan watched from the bridge overlooking the pond. As Fenrir approached the edge of the garden, the mystery revealed itself. A frightened young deer cautiously stepped from the trees. It was unhurt, but its breathing came quickly, and it repeatedly glanced back toward the forest as though searching for a safe place to rest. The little duck gave another clear call. Almost instantly, birds hidden throughout the gardens burst into song. Sparrows filled the branches overhead. Swans glided peacefully across the pond. Ducks emerged from the reeds. The strange silence that had covered the palace all day vanished as naturally as morning fog beneath sunlight. Dr. Amelia Carter, who had just entered the garden carrying fresh herbs, smiled with quiet relief. "It was never fear," she softly said. "They were waiting." The young deer slowly relaxed after seeing the calm gathering of animals around the pond. Fenrir lowered his head in a gentle greeting instead of showing any sign of aggression. The duckling waddled forward until it stood only a few feet from the nervous visitor, releasing one cheerful peep before happily circling back toward the water. The deer cautiously followed. Ethan descended from the bridge and stopped beside Daniel, watching the peaceful encounter unfold. "The duck sensed it long before any of us," Daniel admitted. "Not danger," Ethan answered thoughtfully. "A frightened traveler looking for safety." The realization spread quietly through everyone standing there. The little duck had not been warning the palace about an attack. It had recognized the distress of another vulnerable creature and called for attention before anyone else noticed. Over the following hour, the young deer drank fresh water from the pond, rested beneath the willow tree beside Fenrir, and gradually regained its confidence before calmly returning to the forest at sunset. As the last golden light faded beyond the hills, the palace gardens felt warmer than ever before. Servants who had once laughed at the tiny bird now watched with genuine admiration. They had witnessed something impossible to ignore. The smallest resident of Blackwood Palace had become the first guardian to notice when another life quietly needed kindness. And from that evening forward, no one questioned why every creature in the garden seemed willing to follow wherever the little duck chose to lead. The story of the little duck spread far beyond the palace gardens before the end of the month. Merchants arriving from neighboring kingdoms no longer asked first about trade agreements or harvest reports. Instead, they smiled as they approached the palace gates and politely wondered if the remarkable duck still greeted visitors by the southern pond. To the surprise of the guards, the answer was always yes. Every morning the tiny bird proudly welcomed the sunrise beside Fenrir, then began its familiar walk around the water while birds of every kind quietly followed behind. What had once seemed amusing had slowly become a tradition that no one wished to interrupt. Even the palace servants adjusted their routines without being asked. Fresh grain appeared beside the pond before dawn. Clean water bowls were replaced every afternoon. Gardeners carefully planted colorful wildflowers along the shoreline because they noticed butterflies gathering there more often. The southern garden, once the quietest corner of Blackwood Palace, had become the warmest place in the kingdom. Ethan Blackwood often visited after long hours of governing. He found that difficult decisions somehow felt lighter after watching the peaceful rhythm of the pond. Fenrir rested beneath the willow tree while the duck wandered fearlessly among swans, rabbits, turtles, and songbirds, greeting each familiar face with cheerful confidence. There was no struggle for space, no frightened scattering of wings. Every creature seemed to understand that kindness had become the unspoken rule of the garden. During one council meeting, Lord Nathaniel Hawthorne unexpectedly cleared his throat before addressing the king. The chamber fell silent, expecting another formal discussion about taxes or border roads. Instead, the elderly noble quietly smiled. "Your Majesty, I believe I owe both you and a certain little resident of the palace an apology." Gentle laughter spread around the room. Even Lady Victoria Sinclair nodded with an amused expression. "I once believed dignity required distance," she admitted. "Now I believe dignity may also include compassion." Ethan looked toward the open window where sunlight reached the distant pond. Strength earns respect, he replied calmly. Kindness earns trust. A kingdom needs both. No one argued. Those words quietly settled into the hearts of everyone present. A few days later, Ethan gathered the palace staff, gardeners, guards, and council members beside the southern pond beneath a bright autumn sky. The duck stood beside Fenrir without realizing hundreds of eyes watched its every movement. The king stepped forward and spoke with the same calm voice that had guided the kingdom for years. This pond has become more than part of our gardens. It has become a reminder that the smallest life can change the greatest hearts. He paused, smiling toward the tiny duck. From this day forward, this place shall remain a sanctuary where every peaceful creature is welcome. Warm applause echoed through the gardens. Children cheered the loudest. The duck answered with several delighted peeps before happily flapping its wings across the sparkling water, sending gentle ripples toward every corner of the pond. Fenrir watched with unmistakable pride while birds lifted into the air in graceful circles above them. The scene felt almost like a celebration arranged by nature itself. From that afternoon onward, visitors affectionately began referring to the little bird as the keeper of the palace pond. At first, the nickname sounded playful, but before long it appeared in travelers' stories, children's songs, and paintings displayed throughout nearby villages. No one could remember exactly who had spoken the title first. They only knew it suited the tiny duck perfectly, for wherever it wandered, peace seemed to follow, and the palace itself had become gentler because one great wolf had once chosen compassion over instinct. Seasons passed, and the southern pond became one of the most beloved places in the kingdom. Spring covered the gardens with blossoms that drifted across the water like tiny clouds. Summer filled the air with bright green leaves and the songs of countless birds. Autumn painted every tree in warm shades of gold and crimson, while winter wrapped the palace in sparkling snow that reflected the morning sun like scattered diamonds. Through every changing season, one sight never disappeared. Fenrir rested beneath the old willow tree, and beside him walked the little duck whose life had once depended on a single act of mercy. It was no longer the tiny, frightened duckling rescued after the storm. Its feathers now shone with healthy white and golden tones. Its wings carried it gracefully across the pond, and its confident little calls greeted every new sunrise. Yet despite growing stronger, it never wandered far from the great wolf who had first carried it home. Visitors traveled from distant towns simply to witness the remarkable friendship for themselves. Families brought their children, who stood quietly along the garden paths hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous companions. Artists painted peaceful scenes of the pond. Storytellers filled village squares with tales describing how one gentle decision had transformed an entire palace. Some details changed with every retelling, but one truth remained the same in every version. Kindness had begun the story. Ethan Blackwood often watched these visitors from a nearby terrace. Years earlier, his palace had been admired for its strength, discipline, and towering walls. Now people remembered something different as well. They remembered warmth. They remembered welcome. They remembered a place where every peaceful creature, no matter how small, had a place beside the kingdom's greatest guardian. One quiet evening as the sun settled beyond the distant hills, Ethan sat beside the southern pond with Dr. Amelia Carter and Captain Daniel Brooks. The water reflected ribbons of orange and pink across its calm surface, while birds settled into nearby trees for the night. The duck floated peacefully across the center of the pond before climbing onto the grassy bank beside Fenrir, who gently lowered his head until they rested shoulder to shoulder as they had done since the very beginning. Daniel smiled softly. It is difficult to believe all of this began because Fenrir chose not to walk away. Amelia nodded. Sometimes compassion changes far more than the life standing directly in front of us. Ethan remained quiet for a long moment before speaking. Kings are often remembered for victories, castles, or laws, he said. I hope this kingdom is remembered for something even greater. Daniel looked toward the peaceful pond. And what is that, Your Majesty? Ethan watched the little duck happily leading a line of young ducklings across the shimmering water while swans and songbirds calmly followed nearby. A gentle smile appeared across his face. For becoming a place where strength always made room for kindness. The evening breeze carried the sounds of cheerful birds across the gardens as the first stars appeared overhead. Fenrir closed his eyes peacefully, completely at ease, while the ducks settled comfortably beside him beneath the old willow tree that had witnessed every step of their extraordinary journey. Long after the names of kings and nobles would fade into history, travelers would still pause beside the southern pond and tell their children about the mighty wolf who rescued one tiny duck, and how that little life quietly taught an entire kingdom that true greatness is never measured by size, but by the kindness we choose to share with those who need it most.